Good evening, Liberty.me and other viewers. Welcome to our show tonight. Tonight we've got a wonderful discussion about to take place because it's on Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? A wonderful book written in 1963. Really a book so formative. You know, one thing that's fascinating about the way all these ideas work is that ideas have to be presented new in every generation. Why? Why is that? Well, you know, we like to think of humankind as a special species where we have cumulative knowledge. It's not really true. We have cumulative tools, but our minds have to be reshaped in every generation, and we forget information. We don't know things. So it has to be represented. In Rothbard's case, he represented monetary theory and banking theory in light of his times. This would have been 1963, in a way that explained a lot of the upheaval that was going on at the time. Inflation, the growth of government, tracing it all back to monetary theory. Now, it's fascinating in terms of Rothbard's own life, because he wrote this book, What Has Government Done to Our Money, about the same time he was finishing up Man, Economy, and State. His great work that traced economics from the first principles all the way to the last. It's about a 1,000-page book. This started off as a small monograph that he had written just for, I think, Sound Dollar Committee or something like that, just a small lobbying group that was passed out as a small monograph. And he gradually expanded it over probably 5 editions in the course of his life. And what he attempted to do was explain for a new generation where money comes from, what it is, what its purpose that it serves in the world, and how government tends to destroy it and why, and finally what to do about it. So it's extremely enlightening, and I think I'm pretty certain about this, that it's one of Rothbard's most well-read and famous books because of its brevity, its clarity, its pithiness, and because it speaks to an issue that really needed to be addressed at that time. So, you know, Rothbard would never claim originality in these theories that he lays out here, and neither should we. We need to understand that what Rothbard presents here is the origin of money. It was, in fact, a conventional view dating back hundreds of years. I mean, there were certain schools of thought that denied it. I mean, the issue is, where does money come from? Does it come from markets? Does it come from governments? And that it emerged out of market exchange had been known for hundreds of years previously. And if you have any doubt about that, have a look at Adam Smith and turn to, I think it's chapter 2, section 2, something like that, on the origins of money. Adam Smith tells a story that's not different from Rothbard's own. In Adam Smith's view, what happens is that people, you know, discovered trade, discovered exchange, but were frustrated by the difficulties of barter. So if you had a cow and you wanted to trade it for plywood, you had to have a double coincidence of wants. The person who wanted your cow had to have exactly the right amount of plywood, and you had to want plywood. And if you wanted plywood, you had to, you know, depend on somebody who had plywood to want your cow. And you couldn't divide your cow because dividing the cow would kill it, you know. So there are plenty of problems with barter that make it very inefficient. So the problems with barter incentivize people to discover some good to acquire, not for its consumption value, but rather for its value as a facilitator of trade. You would acquire this good, not to consume it, but anticipation of the possibility that you could readily meet somebody very soon who would similarly want to acquire this good. Maybe not for consumption, but maybe for trading again. This is why Rothbard calls money, and for that matter, Adam Smith did the same thing, calls money the most desirable good. It's the thing that everybody wants. Why? Because it's the most liquid good, the thing that can trade for everything else. What is money? Where does it come from? And why are some things chosen as money and other things not? Well, in Adam Smith's view and Rothbard's view, money can be anything. There's literally no good and potentially no service that can't serve as a kind of a monetary unit. But some things are, just as a matter of empirical reality, more suitable to be money than others. So money has several properties. It tends to be durable. You don't want to get a money that's going to not last very long. So bread doesn't make a very good money because after 24 hours, it's falling apart. So you want a money that's going to persist over time. You want something that's divisible. So cows don't work very well because you cut off their leg. You've got a 3-legged cow that's not very worth a whole lot. So you want to be able to divide up money into ever smaller units, ideally. You also want a good that's got a uniform quality, so that wine in general wouldn't serve as a very good money because there's some good wines and some bad wines, and there's distinctions between them, so they're not liquid or fungible. They're not fungible, as the word goes, between goods. What else? You want a good that's scarce, so there's not an unlimited quantity of them. So the fall leaves don't serve as a very good money because they're, infinite numbers of them and they're constantly being produced. So you want something that's a little bit scarce. So durable, divisibility. Also, you want portability. You don't want something that's so big that it can't be moved around from place to place. You want something that's got a high value in a very small unit. So despite the fact that there have been many kinds of money throughout history, from shells to salt, and everything else you can possibly ever imagine, herbs and spices and whatever, and in prisons or cigarettes, and monies are being invented every day, really. What tended to emerge is money over time. And again, this is a story that Rothbard tells that's, identical to the story you find in The Wealth of Nations. And by the way, Adam Smith didn't invent the story either. I mean, The Wealth of Nations was a very interesting book because it accumulated the existing knowledge of people who thought about economics all into one big treatise, and that's why it's so famous. It wasn't original; it's just famous because it was well written, well packaged. But so they both agree that over time, what emerges as money is precious metals, gold and silver, because they have all those properties: divisibility and portability, a high value per unit of weight, uniformity in quality, and so on. So these are all features of money. So money emerges naturally out of the market. Now, I have to tell you, so Rothbard goes further, because Adam Smith does not do this. Adam Smith explains all this, and then makes a misstep and says that government had to monopolize money to give it credibility, to give it a high status among the population. So the government would place the official stamp on it, and that's what caused it to be secure in its value and widely trusted. Rothbard doesn't believe this, and he actually argues the opposite, that markets themselves are capable of granting money their validity, their authenticity, and to grant credibility to money. Rothbard's a brilliant anarchist thinker, of course, and he saw that the role of government in money was never to shore it up or give it more value or make it more trusted. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. And the funny thing about Adam Smith, when you read him, he grants this too. He says that the great enemy of sound money is governments. And there's no greater mischief that's ever been created in the world population, in world history, than governments monopolizing money. So Adam Smith recognizes this too. As any decent economist, even John Maynard Keynes recognized this, right? So, but the beauty of Rothbard's text is that he puts this all together. He tells a story: the origin of money, the origin of banking, government's involvement with banks, taking over of and monopolization of money and banking by governments, leading to its destruction. So when I first read this, I was amazed because Rothbard takes it to that next level and speculates about the possibility that a really great monetary reform would consist in getting government completely out of the money business, by which he meant even private coinage. So how do you guarantee weights and measures without a government? Rothbard takes this subject on directly. He's asked the question. He's like, well, how can, in a system of anarchy, a system of no governments, how can you have a credible currency that with weights and measures that you can depend on? And he points out that weights and measures and standardization is genuinely a market function. I mean, you think about all the goods in the market economy that are standardized with each other. It's just something that happens naturally because it's something that consumers want. Consumers want standardization, so markets produce them. We see this all the time in standardization and DVD sizes and computer plugs. Not always, but most of the time. And lawnmower blades and sizes of screws you can get at Home Depot. Clothing sizes. There's always a tendency towards standardization, insofar as consumers really desire it, and standardization benefits the business enterprises in question. And so it is with money. To have uniform weights and measures is genuinely a market function that does not require any kind of government involvement whatsoever. So in Rothbard's view, coinage should be entirely private, should be produced as a private enterprise. When I first read this, as I mentioned to you, I was blown away by this insight, and I thought it was like something like an indication of my own mindset, but I thought it was the most radical idea I'd ever heard, and thinking it made me feel like I was thinking the most dangerous thought that had ever been thought. To believe that government shouldn't monopolize money, or even be involved in it at all, but rather private enterprise ought to manage it. Interestingly, a few years ago, the monetary historian named George Selgin, who's now, I believe, at the Cato Institute, came out with a wonderful book called Good Money. That was a brilliant piece of original research. I have a look at it. I'm not sure if it's even available on ebook. I think it's mostly a physical book. Extraordinary photographs, high production value. But what he showed was that at the origins of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, government coinage was insufficient for the needs of trade at the time. There were all sorts of new factories being created and introduced in outside of the government purview and outside of London, and they needed some way to pay their workers. So the enterprises themselves sought out producers of money, and lots of enterprises got involved in making money out of precious metals. And what's interesting about that is that there's a whole new industry that came about. Very beautiful coinage, far more beautiful than the government's made, was being produced by private enterprise. Most of the factories that produced money at the time were, of all things, button. They had the machinery because they were making buttons. They could also make coins. So many button-making factories converted themselves into coinage factories and came out with their own coins, which they would sell at a premium to the new enterprises. We're talking about the early part of the 18th century in Britain. Sell to the new enterprises that would distribute these small coinages to the workers, so they could pay them in the amounts that they promised, so they could fulfill the contracts. Government was very bad at making coins because it always made large denomination coins with the Queen's stamp on it and everything else. But they weren't suitable for paying workers. You needed small coins. They needed small change. So that's when private enterprise got involved. And so as a result, there's a gigantic burgeoning industry all throughout England during the Industrial Revolution of private coinage designed to support the needs of trade during the early years of the Industrial Revolution. Now, this research that George Selgin unearthed in this brilliant book, Good Money, comes out 50 years or so after Rothbard's first, as far as I know in the modern period, speculation that coinage could be entirely private. So there you go. Rothbard had the theory, George Selgin had the history. That made a real beautiful combination. It's a great illustration to me of how the merit of having high theory really is. I mean, if you're thinking correctly, you can sort of deduce through what the empirical reality is. And then, it makes it all the more compelling when you have a theorist like Selgin who comes along and actually shows, how it works. So Rothbard is right. Coinage, it's not just that it originated privately, as Adam Smith said, and Karl Menger too, of course, much later during the marginal revolution of the late 19th century Austria. Rothbard 1963 underscores this, but Rothbard goes further and says it should have stayed that way, and government should have never been involved in it. Now, what about banking? In Rothbard's view, banking comes about, and this is again not an unusual view, because precisely because coinage tended to be gold and silver, and you didn't really want to carry around gold and silver because it's too heavy, it's bulky, if you accumulated too much, you needed a safe place for it. You would only want to carry around enough money to accommodate the needs of trade, but your savings would have to occur through some sort of service that would provide a sort of stockpiling or warehousing services for your gold. And that's where banking originated. Bankers would say, well, look, we'll keep your gold, we'll keep your silver here, we'll keep it safe, in exchange for which we'll give you this piece of paper, which, because of our reputation, because people understand we're trustworthy, they will take that paper too. And that was the origin of paper money, very much of a market-oriented origin, which Rothbard seriously regretted in a way, because of course, there's always a grave temptation on the part of bankers to, oh, and by the way, the bankers would also serve as lenders too, right? Because they've got a big stockpile of gold. You're not using the gold. Why not employ that gold in some sort of investment purposes, in return for which you would gain interest. So the bankers would lend it out to businessmen on speculation. And when the investments would return, you would get a portion of that, of the proceeds. And it was well understood that the depositor was engaged in risky behavior. That's why he earned a rate of interest in return. So there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in Rothbard's view, this is called loan banking. And that's not fraudulent, it's not shady, it's just a good solid exchange. But Rothbard has this view that, and it's historically correct, that even without sort of loan banking contracts, bankers would quite often be aware of their vast amounts of specie reserves that they had in warehouse, and would take it upon themselves to loan that money out to speculate that the people who were keeping things in the warehouse were not going to return immediately, that the notes were flowing and circulating on a predictable level, and they wouldn't need to have enough specie to immediately pay off every holder of paper money upon demand, even without a loan contract. This was what Rothbard called fractional reserve deposit banking. And in Rothbard's view, this is fraud, because what you're doing is you're creating more tickets, titles to gold than really exist in the real world. You're inventing new forms of property. And he thought this is the origin of banking instability, because once word got out that the warehouse did not have enough to pay all depositors, there would be runs on banks, And these runs would lead all depositors to rush to the bank. Banks didn't have enough money to pay them, and they would lean toward the government to bail them out. Now, why would governments do this? Well, the reason they would do this is because quite often the banking industry, and this is true in the Medicis in the High Middle Ages, were working hand in hand with governments because they had the money. Governments need the money, didn't always successfully get it through taxation, so would borrow the money from the banking industry. So they had every incentive to bail out the banks when the runs made them unstable. So that was the origin of this close relationship between banks and governments. It came about in the High Middle Ages and persisted ever since. Culminating, in Rothbard's view, in the creation of central banking in the 20th century, which was, central banks are very different from national banks that you get in the 19th century. 19th century America, for example, you often had, and this is true in 18th century Britain with the Bank of England, we had the first national bank, second national bank. These were banks that were established specifically to serve the government. They weren't central banks proper because they weren't a monopolized banking system. You still had competitive banking. It's just you had this one big banking institution that was designed to serve the government, but it wasn't inclusive of all banks. Central banking is very different. It takes the next step. It says that if you're going to be a bank, you have to be part of our clearinghouse system. We're going to regulate you, give you permission to exist, and we'll be the sort of central planning mechanism for the entire banking industry. First central bank existed in Germany, 18th century under Bismarck, moved to England, moved to America, and now, of course, 21st century, the world's dominated by central banks. So that's a quick story. Telling the story from the origin of money all the way through the origin to central banking. It follows an inevitable historical trajectory. But as I look at the story, you have to think about this. Like, at what point did money go from being a market good to being a national good, something owned and centrally planned by the state? It was the point at which people gave up their specie to give to the warehousing services, essentially. And why did they do that? Because money was heavy, it took up space, and they needed some place to store it. So in a sense, and that was just part of physical reality. But it's this one sort of flaw in gold and silver that doomed, in a way, the sound money system of the past, and that it to become central banking, because once you deposit with the warehouses are tempted to distribute more paper than they have specie. They get into trouble. They've got a close relationship with the government. The government bails them out and creates a cartel-like arrangement to increasingly so-called stabilize the system and provide a liquid system of money and banking. And then that, in turn, becomes the kind of a fuel for the creation of the Leviathan, for the funding of terrible things like world wars, large welfare states, gigantic governments that are oppressing us. All originates from the warehouse function of banks, and that in turn flows out of the flaw of gold and silver money, namely that it weighs something and that it costs a lot to port around. So you have to rely on the services of warehousing agents. So I'm telling the story this way because, Murray died in 1995, right on the cusp of the origin of the digital age, which I tend to mark from the invention of the web browser, because that's what led to the commercialization of the web. And by commercialization, I just don't mean that people started making money from it or running ads on the web or whatever, but from the inclusion of the whole world of population potentially in this thing we call the internet today. Really, 1995 is that great hinge of history. Rothbard died exactly at that time, so he was never able to see the development of this new world that we're living in today. In 1995, we began to see the origin of internet commerce. People began to sell things. It became a source of commercial relationships, and it was an awesome thing. There was a hysteria, that resulted as from the origins of internet commerce. I think Amazon was founded in 1997, something like that. 3 years later, we had the big dot-com bust. Internet commerce blew up. All the big stocks that were soaring high came crashing down again, and people came to be very skeptical of the internet and its uses in commerce. And it took another probably 5 years to fully recover. But now, here we are in 2015, and the world is being remade daily by the awesome power of internet commerce. The one big missing piece that was always there, and was Milton Friedman who pointed this out, and F.A. Hayek also did, was that we never really had a money for the internet. And by money from the for the internet, I mean something that lives outside the nation state, like the internet itself, like information itself. Something that could be accessible to the whole of the human family, something that enabled us to exchange peer to peer. Until 2009, every attempt to create a unique money good for the internet had failed. Digital monies were elusive. The reason they were elusive is that digital money digital goods by their nature are reproducible. You don't want that with money. Remember we talked earlier about features of money. One of them is scarcity. How do you create scarcity out of information? Information by its nature wants to be free, it wants to be reproducible, it wants to be infinite. It's an infinite good. You can't have an infinite good that also works as money. So there were attempts to create things like e-gold, and there are other attempts all throughout the early 2000s to create digital monies, but they all flopped because they were inflationary and they're subject to so much fraud. And there was no real good way to account for spending habits. And moreover, they were typically created by private businesses, and private businesses, you have a single point of failure. You have to be able to trust the business in question. And that's a problem. It's a problem when it comes to money, because you don't want to have to trust a business like you have traditionally with bankers. You want to be able to trust the money itself. Well, in 2008, on October 31st, yesterday, 7 years ago, we saw the white paper for Bitcoin introduced by Satoshi Nakamoto. You can still get it online. It's still worth reading because it's an awesome document. It really holds up. And what he imagined was fascinating, because it's old-fashioned on one hand and super high-tech on the other. He imagined a global ledger system that would distribute metaphorical units of exchange called Bitcoin, and to move with this ledger around and to reassign the titles, you had to access the blockchain, the so-called blockchain, through a private key. And this private key would give you access to buy and sell these goods, which were worth nothing at the time, but it would change the ledger and reassign ownership rights to these mythical things called Bitcoins to certain public addresses behind which existed a private key. So it used a double key encryption to provide that access. And it's fascinating the way he sort of doped it out, because it's almost as if Satoshi Nakamoto had read Rothbard's book. He modeled Bitcoin on the gold standard. So for example, you had to have verification services for these expenditures. You had to have people willing to host the blockchain and people to verify whether you were accessing the blockchain or not accessing the blockchain. And that requires CPU power. If you're willing to donate your CPU power to this cause of verifying transactions and confirming them, then you will have provided some proof of work. Your proof of work is your verification services, in exchange for which you would get newly created Bitcoin. which were created according to a very strict protocol that was adaptable, that would change over time, which now is distributing, I think, about 25 coins every 10 minutes or so. But this is flexible. I think in the early days it was a lot more, and in the future it'll be a lot less. But they would be the first owners of the new Bitcoin. So his metaphor here was gold mining. He was a gold standard guy, essentially. And he called it mining because, you know, the miners, when gold became money, would go into new territories where there's rumored to be gold. And first they'd pan the rivers, easy to get. And whoever found gold became the first owners of the gold. And they'd take it to the bank and, you know, and like that. To become the first owners of gold. And it's the same way with Bitcoin. So mining services now, the algorithms that are associated with verification services get increasingly difficult and require ever more higher CPU power. And the more people that are involved in mining, the less proceeds there comes to any individual. So in the early days of Bitcoin, for example, it would have been easy enough for me to use the computer I'm on right now to mine Bitcoin and actually make a lot of money. In fact, I could be a billionaire today if I had been mining in 2009, as there are some out there. But as Bitcoin rose in value, more and more people got into the mining business, and now it's impossible. You can mine Bitcoin if you want from your computer, but you pay more for the electricity that it costs to mine than you will get in Bitcoin. So it's not actually worth it for you. That's why mining is very much centralized now, or at least associated with just a handful of firms, mostly operating in places with very low electricity charges like China. So that's how mining has changed. But you can see how Satoshi used the metaphor of the gold standard to kind of construct his own system. The critical contribution of Bitcoin is that it overcame the problem of the digital age, whereas before, every new digital coin that had been innovated was able to be hacked and reproduced. Some of them were, you know, subject to corruption at the top by companies, the same way the banks, you know, once they got a hold of the gold, would issue more tickets than they had specie to back it. It was the same thing with previous digital currencies of Bitcoin. The blockchain existed on a distributed ledger, so it didn't belong to anybody in particular. It was publicly accessible. And something that had to be balanced out every 10 minutes. So the new coins would enter into the blockchain, verification would be provided, and everything would be carefully monitored algorithmically and also through human labors. And as a result, the damn thing worked. It's actually remarkable when you think back of the history of Bitcoin, because the so-called Genesis block, meaning the first block of Bitcoin that was ever issued, I think was issued something like January 4th, something like that, 2009. And there were something like maybe fewer than 200 people in the world and who had even a passing interest in this. And there was probably more like 6 to a dozen people who had an intense interest in it. It's amazing you think back at this. But those handful of people, you know, watched the release of the white paper. They're very impressed, and they began to bang on the system and tried to make it work. And they did this 100 transactions a day, typically, on average, between January and October of 2009. And finally, on October 5th, I believe it was, 2009, about 1 year after the release of the white paper, Bitcoin obtained its first monetary value of something like a 1/16 of a penny. But that was the proof of concept. It showed that Bitcoin, it's something that doesn't actually exist in any real sense, obtained its first market value. So there we have the proof of concept. For the first time ever, we saw the creation of a coin that existed not within central banks and not from governments, but purely as a market phenomenon, exactly the way Rothbard described money originating in the markets. Remarkable. Now, I've thought a lot about about this, where would Murray be? Murray was not godlike. He wasn't infallible. He was brilliant. Where would he have been on Bitcoin? And my guess is that he would have been one of the biggest skeptics of Bitcoin. Mainly because I think his first impression might have been that it violates the regression theorem that he explains in this book, What Is Government Done to Our Money? The regression theorem posits that before something can become a money, it must first have value in the market as an instrument of exchange. It first has to have a commodity value in barter, and then as that value, as that good becomes ever more marketable, it eventually obtains a monetary value, not for consumption, but just purely as a facilitator of trade. That's not exactly the story of Bitcoin. I think he would have looked at Bitcoin and said, look, you can't just create a money out of computer code. That's crazy. But I think, and I must tell you, I started writing about this subject when it was about spring of 2013, when I first started releasing articles about the topic. It's a little difficult for me to describe to you what it was like for me, because I faced probably the greatest barrage of criticism for any series of articles I've ever written. The number of skeptics, the incredulity was intense. People who had never studied Bitcoin, knew nothing about computer code, knew nothing about the value of code, nothing about the blockchain, nothing about cryptography, came after me, hammer and tongs, denouncing me for falling for a Ponzi scheme, as if it was just crazy and contradicting everything about Misesian Rothbardian monetary theory. So it was a rough period for me personally, because I didn't expect that. I thought, well, now here's a monetary innovation. Let me explain it and celebrate it. That was really all I was trying to do. So I wrote probably a dozen articles on the topic, but I faced, unbelievable opposition from many old colleagues. Actually, it's incredible when I think about it. People I thought were very smart monetary economists just refused to look outside the window and see what was going on with Bitcoin, seeing that it had actually solved real technological problems. And, maybe I'm wrong to think that Rothbard might have been among them. But, I look back at a piece that he wrote called, I think it's called In Defense of the 100% Gold Dollar. And it's a big attack on Hayek. And it's in particular an attack on his 1974 book, Denationalization of Money. In Rothbard's view, we already have the money, and that money is the dollar, it's the euro, or in his time, Deutschmark, whatever, the franc, the yen. And there's the network's effects of that are so intense that no new money could ever compete with them. So you couldn't just come up with a new money out of nowhere. Nobody would ever take it seriously, any more than if, as he used to say, if you wrote a ticket out that was called the One Rothbard and tried to market that, anybody would take that. And he's right about it to this extent. If I had just made something called the Bitcoin and said, "Here's my Bitcoin, why don't you accept it as money?" nobody would have ever accepted it as money. And he's right. But I think the problem with this kind of analysis is that it's a little bit technologically superficial. It doesn't really understand that there's more going on with Bitcoin than just the creation of a metaphorical unit of exchange. The bartered good, so to speak, that backs Bitcoin is in fact blockchain services, which is an awesome service. Let me try to describe what that service is and why it matters. The blockchain allows for the commodification of information bundles and the titling of those bundles as private property, and the immutable porting of that information titled commodified bundle peer-to-peer to any other person in the world so that it arrives exactly as it was sent, and it is a non-reproducible information bundle. So the technology that allows that is an awesome service that makes possible not just money, but titles to property, contracting, for example. Anything you can do with information can be done through the blockchain in a way in which it had never been done before, so that it's non-forgeable, immutable, verified. All the things you want property to be become possible on the blockchain. That's an awesome service, and the first time in the history of the world that anybody had ever come up with a technology that allowed that immensely useful service to exist. So in a sense, Bitcoin is backed not by a commodity, like gold once backed the dollar, but is backed by a service. And I don't even like the word backed by, because what Bitcoin does is it allows you access to this service. And that's the source of its value. If it were even conceivable to separate Bitcoin out from the blockchain, like think of the blockchain as a separate service and the Bitcoin as a separate currency, Bitcoin would have no value whatsoever. It's its unity with the blockchain that is the source of its value. And I just, as brilliant as Rothbard was, I think that it would have required him to do some study and some understanding of this in order to understand the origins of Bitcoin. I think he eventually would have celebrated it. So here we are in 2015, and it's fascinating to me because I began to write about this in 2013 when I think Bitcoin was worth about $12 when I first started kind of getting involved in it. And it was not popular. There were not that many people who were writing about it. And then it went up to $30. Everybody said, well, this Ponzi scheme is a bubble. It's going to come crashing down. And over the course of the year, it gradually, it grew more and more intense and attracted ever more popular attention. Eventually, I think by the end of 2013, it reached that high watermark of $1,200 right at the time of Mt. Gox falling apart, which I think was definitely a bubble. There's various reasons why that happened. It wasn't a real price. It was too much too fast in any case, and then tumbled back down again. I'm not sure what the low was. I'm not sure if it ever slipped below $200. But I never panicked during this 2014 period of the price falling because, I remembered when it was $30 and everybody was screaming that it was a bubble, And to me, the exchange rate of Bitcoin doesn't really matter. Whether it's a penny, a 16th a penny, or $1 million doesn't really matter. What matters is that for the first time ever, you have a global digital good that could obtain monetary value. And that by itself is an awesome thing. It's a confirmation of everything that Rothbard writes about in What Has Government Done to Our Money. It's proof that he was right. Whether Rothbard himself would have seen how his ideas were fulfilled in Bitcoin, I just don't know. He died, and I think it's disrespectful to even go there. You can speculate, but we don't really know. But it really does confirm Rothbard's theory. So what happened over the last 18 months with Bitcoin? Well, after it tumbled from its high, remarkable things happened. People began to understand for the first time what the blockchain is capable of doing. A lot of VC, very smart venture capital money has been pouring into Bitcoin investments. We've now got, I forget what the latest numbers are. It's something like 500 million, maybe it's 800 million, something like that. Poured into Bitcoin investments. We've got Visa, MasterCard, American Express, all the world's largest banks involved in blockchain technologies. People recognize that it's a much better way of pulling value because it doesn't have the risk of fraud that leads to the very high transaction fees we associate with credit cards now. It's just a vastly superior technology, and many people are betting on the potential that it could break the network effect of existing payment systems and possibly at some point in the future, money itself. I was looking at some of the data today about Bitcoin. It's used much more heavily in Europe than it is in the US, and used more heavily in the US than it is in China. But look at the latest price run up. Most all the activity is growing out of China, not uncoincidentally associated with the threat of new capital controls in China. So people who are attempting to move their money out are looking to Bitcoin as a possibility, because it allows you to become your own banker. So let me go back again. Remember I talked about how the failing of gold and silver and precious metals is that it weighs a lot and it's difficult to port around, takes up space. That's why we had to rely on warehousing services banks. Pardon me. Bitcoin weighs nothing, and it takes up no space. It's a purely digital instrument, and it's designed to individuate banking services so that you become your own banker, basically, with Bitcoin. And that's an awesome fact. I mean, I have a wallet in my on my smartphone that gives immediate access to a private key that allows me to access the blockchain without asking anybody's permission. That's an awesome thing. So the very thing that corrupted our money at the very outset, all the way back to the Medicis in the 16th century, is now we can bypass it. Forget fractional reserve banking. Bitcoin banking services are necessarily 100% reserve banking all the time. You have access to your stuff, and you can spend it. And every even service like Coinbase and many others that mix Bitcoin and give you sort of services that allow you to spend it, buy it, sell it, and spend it. They're 100% reserve services. So it's a kind of the achievement of a Rothbardian dream. So I hope you understand what I'm saying. To me, it's kind of remarkable that What is Government Doing with Money, this book in 1963, sort of perfectly captured, in theory and history, the ideal banking services, money and banking service that would be innovated in 2008 by an anonymous programmer named Satoshi Nakamoto. And now we're living in the reality of Bitcoin today. So how far have we come along? Well, we've come along a very long way. 2015, I think, will always be looked back at as the year in which the blockchain was really built and Bitcoin began to realize a kind of new level of maturity, despite the fact that your neighbors are not talking about it, despite the fact that the MSNBC or CNBC or whatever and New York Times business pages are not talking about it anymore. It's because of the low exchange rate, and that's the way it always happens, right? When the low exchange rates of any assets are low, nobody cares. When they're high and going higher, then everybody starts talking about it. It's just the nature of the financial markets. Technology doesn't descend as if it's from a cloud. There's enter into the real world and all the fallibilities and human psychology is associated with that. But behind the scenes, we've seen some extraordinary infrastructure development over the last year. As I say, with large banks and credit card payment systems and many others involved in this. And now we've seen Bitcoin break through that $250 barrier where it had existed for like the last 12 to 14 months, something like that. And now I think it reached a high of 350 a few days ago. I think it's back down again to 319 or something like that. But as far as I'm concerned, the sky's the limit. There are a finite number of Bitcoins in the world, which means that the exchange rate can go much higher. When? I don't know. I'm tired of making predictions. I called $1,000 Bitcoin perfectly right, almost to the day. And I should have hung up my prediction hat at that moment because I've been wrong ever since. So don't listen to me on this. It was an awesome thing that I called that one, but I've failed ever since. They say when it comes to predictions, it's fine to give a price, it's fine to give a time, but don't ever give both. So there you go. I expect Bitcoin to go much higher. It's inevitable. But again, it doesn't really matter. The invention of Bitcoin holds out the prospect of a new universal system of record keeping, titling, contract making, and even universal money that exists outside the nation state. And that's an awesome thing. I opened this discussion tonight talking about human fallibility. Why is it that every new generation has to be retaught things that we didn't know before? Rothbard retaught us monetary theory in 1963. It'll be retaught again and again. The books come out every day on this topic. But while we have to learn new intellectual knowledge, we don't have to learn new technological knowledge. That becomes part of the commons of the whole of humanity, whether it's the wheel or the horseshoe or internal combustion or the methodology for making steel or electricity or flight or programming languages in our own time, digital technologies and microchip and so on. Every new innovation becomes part of the common store of humanity's capital. And that's exactly what's happened to the blockchain. It exists. We know how it works. We know that it's possible. We know what it can do. And it's part of the common store of knowledge of the whole of humanity and will continue to be for the rest of time. So it seems to me, and I don't use this word lightly, inevitable that blockchain technology and Bitcoin or some other branded coin will eventually compete directly with nation state money and supersede them because they're more secure, it's better money, it's cheaper to port, technologically far superior. It is to, as email was to letters, so Bitcoin is to national monies. Better technology just tends to last and tends to displace, even insofar as there's government attacks on it, which we've seen over Bitcoin over the last 12 months. So these are very exciting times to be alive. So I'm very happy to have given this talk on the 7th anniversary of Bitcoin and the, what is it? Really, I guess, 52nd anniversary or something of Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money. A book and a technology that are united in spirit, favoring sound money, believing in the power of the people, believing that money emerges from markets and should stay there, shouldn't be monopolized by governments. It should always serve the needs of trade in an organic way, consistent with a capitalist ethos and fulfilling the commercial aspirations of humanity. It's always looking for ways to live a better life. This book and this technology are united, one and the same. So that's my talk for tonight. I'm going to, for once, I'm going to be on time. Thank you so much for joining me and for hanging out with me. If this is your, by the way, every day I get people who've been reading my writings on Bitcoin for 2 years who write me for the first time going, how do I get involved in Bitcoin? It's sort of a frustrating question because I've answered it, like 10,000 times, but of course, people only listen once it actually affects them, and people are getting interested in Bitcoin now. I mean, the best way is just to, I don't know, find a friend who owns it, download a wallet, remember your password, get somebody to transport a fraction of Bitcoin to you, whatever. Or you can do the more formal way of going to a service like Coinbase and just buying it through your bank account. But whether you do that or not, the reason I think you should do it is not because I think you're going to get rich, but because I think it's fun to be an owner. I mean, it's fun to be the owner of something that's new and upcoming and fabulous. Whether you do it or not, keep a careful lookout. This is the future. If you haven't read the new article in this week's Economist magazine, the Economist has a wonderful cover story on blockchain technology and the Bitcoin, and they have a world in the shape of a gear and a chain going around the world with a spoke with a Bitcoin. And it's a beautifully innovative graphic and one of the best I've ever seen. The Economist magazine. 2 years ago, inconceivable. Today, yeah, the world's coming around. Yeah, I have to remind myself of this because, I was called crazy. I was called a nutcase. I was called a fool. But I had a feeling about it. And, I was right. You see my cufflinks? Dogecoin. Fourth most capitalized cryptocurrency in the world. So there's a future for that one too. Stay optimistic, stay bright, my friends. Keep looking out the window. Have a good theory, have a good connection to reality. We're going to remake the world together on a market basis through innovation, creativity, daring, and breaking down these old structures of the nation state that are so anachronistic, so thrown back, and so irrelevant to our digital age. All the best, and see you on Liberty.me. Thank you for participating and for being here with me tonight. Take care.